What's up, jackalopes? I'm Hope, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in January. And I'm actually really excited about this because I read more than I usually do in January in terms of the number of things that I read. A lot of these were short, but pretty much everything that I read was 3 stars and above. Actually, I think I didn't have anything under 3 stars. So really, it was a really good reading month for me. Everything was pretty good quality, and I had at least one new favorite. So that was really cool. And without any further ado, let's just jump into what I read. So the first thing that I read in January was Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I got this one from my local library and I absolutely loved it. This was my first book of the year and it was immediately a new favorite. I think that this book is so beautifully written. It's got this very fairy tale style writing to it, so it feels a bit like a story that you would be told around a campfire. But I think that worked really well for the narrative that it told, and I really enjoyed the relationships between the different characters, particularly between Cassiopeia, who is the protagonist, and Hunkame, who is the Mayan god of death that she inadvertently sets upon the world, which is kind of where the story kicks off. She sets this Mayan death god on the world on accident and ends up going on this grand adventure to help him regain his powers. So that's very simply the premise, and it just is such a complex and beautiful story. The characters are really good. I like that there's really no character who's like evil. There are antagonists, but there's no character who's like evil or just doing things for the sake of being evil. They all have their own reasons for the things that they're doing, and I thought that was really interesting that we got to see the motivations of all the different characters, and we got to see how they interacted with each other and how their motivations were, and sometimes similar, but they would have like different ways of going about things. So I thought that it was absolutely wonderful. 5 out of 5 stars, 100% recommend it. I'm really finding that I love Silvia Moreno Garcia's writing, and the two books that I've read from her are extremely different because I read this one and I read Mexican Gothic last year, and the writing style is different, the genre is different, but the way that she tells a story is just so compelling, and the thematic elements that she works in are just really deep and interesting. So she's definitely becoming a new favorite author. I've given both of her books so far 5 stars, and this was a super strong start to the month for me. The second book that I read in the month of January was, I can get a hold of it, The Devotion of Suspect X by Keigo Higashino. This is a murder mystery, and it's about this woman who kills her ex-husband, and then her neighbor helps her cover it up. So we know who committed the murder, but then the detective, I can't remember the detective's name right now, but there is a detective and then a physicist who's a friend of his, and the physicist regularly helps the police because he's very logical, he's very good at putting together patterns, and they jokingly call him Detective Galileo. And so he ends up helping the main detective kind of solve this case. And it's really interesting because it's kind of cat and mouse in that they believe that the woman killed her husband, but they don't know why, they don't know how she's covered it up, but they also are not realizing that the neighbor is helping her cover it up. So it's all about this game between the neighbor and the detectives to try and prevent them from basically proving that this woman has killed her husband. And it's just really well done. I thought that the puzzle parts of it were really interesting, and the logic was great. I felt like the ending made sense. It all kind of came together. There weren't any clues that kind of blindsided me, and that's a thing that I hate in mysteries. So it was really interesting that even though the focus of this mystery was different, where it was figuring out kind of why and how they covered it up, I felt like the clues were laid out really well, and I didn't feel like there was a cheap twist at the end. It was just really well done, and if you love mysteries, this one is a really good one. This is the second book I've read from Keigo Higashino, and he's another author that I'm finding that I really like his work. I think there's a few more of these that have been translated into English, so I'm really excited to start picking those up too. But yeah, this is a really solid mystery story. Back over there. And then the third thing that I read in January was A Court of Frost and Starlight by Sarah J. Maas. I keep pushing things right off the edge of the camera. This is the kind of I like to call it the Christmas special. It's not Christmas, it's winter solstice. But this is the Christmas special at the end of the first ACOTAR trilogy. This is basically catching up with the characters after the events of the third book. So I can't say a whole lot about this book in particular because it would spoil all of the first three books. But I thought this was a really interesting premise. It's not very plot heavy. It is very much a book that is just checking in with the characters after the kind of main events of the series and seeing where they are, what their relationships with each other are like now, how things have changed for them after the events of the first three books. And I think that's really interesting because I think in a lot of series that's not something that we get. I like seeing the consequences of things for characters. So I thought this was, it didn't have plot, but it was a really interesting look into what their lives are like now after all of these major events have happened. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, I think this is worth reading, but it doesn't really set up anything new for the next set of books that are about to come out. Court of Silver Flames comes out in a few days. It's the 14th. Actually, it comes out in 2 days. It's the 14th of February at the moment. So if you are interested in that kind of aspect of like what happens after, I think this is worth reading, but I don't necessarily think that if you've read the first 3 books, you need to read this one to be ready for the next one. I did read it because I wanted to be fully caught up, but it's definitely going to be a taste thing because this is pretty light on the plot. Then the fourth thing that I read, and the last of my physical books, is The Monster of Ellenhaven by Jennifer Geisbrecht. I'm not sure how to pronounce that exactly, but this one is a novella about the Monster of Ellenhaven. It's about a monster and a sorcerer and their plan to destroy everything. And that is really all I can say about this because that's all there is to say about this. It's an interesting kind of character study about this strange relationship between the 2 main characters, Johann and Florian, and that's basically all it is. It's these like little vignettes and bits of their time together that kind of come together to tell a vague story about this big plan for revenge on the people who have, in their minds, harmed the city of Ellenhaven. But beyond being a really interesting kind of case study and a kind of experimental feeling book, I think that this is somewhat forgettable overall. I think the writing is beautiful. I really enjoyed the writing style in this. There were some interesting thematic ideas being played with here. The writing was very descriptive, not like super flowery, but it was very striking, I think. There were some really striking images in here. And the way things came together was interesting, but again, I think this is ultimately a little forgettable, so unless you're really into like case studies and really into horror, maybe skip this one. But I enjoyed it. I'm glad I picked it up, and the thing that I thought was really interesting here is that it's like a horror novel, but it's not scary in the typical sense because it's from the perspective of the monsters. So that was a really interesting twist on the genre that I enjoyed reading. The next several things I read were, that's 4, so I have 2 more things. They were both short stories. The first of these was I, Cthulhu by Neil Gaiman, which is it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a like short story from the perspective of Cthulhu, and it's like Cthulhu telling about how he ended up on Earth and like why he is now, dead and sleeping under the sea. And so it's just kind of a fun little adventure story of Cthulhu being like, yeah, here's how I got here. And I think that it's a really fun story if you're really into Lovecraftian horror and that kind of like cosmic horror, if you're really into the Cthulhu mythos, and if you really like Neil Gaiman's writing, I think it's definitely worth reading. It's really short and it's available, I think, on, is it Tor's website? It's available free online. You can link to it from the Goodreads page, but it's a very fun, quick read, and I'm glad that I picked it up because I really like cosmic horror, so it was fun. And that's really all I feel I have to say about it. The last thing that I read was another short story called The Professor's Assassin by Matthew Pearl. This is kind of a prequel. It's a short story prequel to another book of his called The Technologists, but it follows this character whose name I cannot remember. It's William something. It was a very plain name, but the character is actually a real person. It's the man who founded MIT. So let me just like, find his name, because it's gonna bother me. William Barton Rogers. So it follows him before he founds MIT, and it's during his time teaching at, I believe it's the University of Virginia, and it follows a series of events in which there is a student uprising, and one of the other professors is killed. And it follows William's attempts to figure out who killed him, because the local police have basically said that there's really not much that they can do to find him. They are kind of spread too thin. They've got like one guy who can come investigate, and he's about to leave. So William takes it upon himself to solve this mystery and get justice for the man who died, because the man who died was a very close friend of his. So it basically follows that, and it's set in like the 1840s at the University of Virginia. So the setting is really interesting. I think this is overall an interesting entry. I like Matthew Pearl's writing. He writes historical literary thrillers, which I really enjoy. I read his book, The Dante Club, several years ago, and absolutely loved it. And in fact, that sparked a whole interest in Dante for me. But I think that this is a story that was both too long and too short. It felt like the ending happened a little too quickly. There just wasn't enough there to really give a satisfying, solid ending. But also, it felt like, because it was so short, it progressed extremely quickly, whereas events could have been let breathe a little bit. But I think it's partially due to the fact that it is based on an actual thing that happened. It's based on real events, and they're real events that there's just not a lot of information about them. So I totally see why the story was written the way it is, and I think if you like that kind of historical thriller or historical literary thriller, I think it's a fun story. I enjoyed reading it. I just think that it was not as good as some of his other works. But those are all of the things that I read in January, and I was really pleased with this list because ultimately I enjoyed everything I read. There were some things here that I liked a little bit less, and it really had to do with, in some senses, the length of the stories or the kind of how, like, full of content they felt. I think with both of these shorter things that I didn't like as much, it was that they felt a little thin to me, if that makes sense. But on the whole, a really successful reading month. The very first thing I read this year was a new favorite, so I'm really happy with how January went, and that kind of energy has really continued for me into February, so I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes next. But with all of that said, that's all I have for you today, and thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've enjoyed making it. I really enjoyed talking about these books because so many of them are so good, and I hope that I will see you in the next video. Bye.